Sensory Processing by Kristen Dedge, made in conjunction with Amanda Saliba Pediatric Occupational Therapy Services. In order to understand sensory processing, you must first know the senses that every human has. We all have 8 senses, but only 5 are commonly known. That's your sense of smell, vision, auditory or hearing, taste or oral input, and touch. The 3 lesser known senses we're going to talk about more, and those are proprioception, vestibular, and interoception. Our senses are pivotal for providing information about our environment and about our body within our environment. The first sense that we're going to talk about is proprioception. It's also known as our deep touch sense, and the receptors are located in our muscles and joints. It provides our brain with information about where our body is in space. This means it's telling us our position, orientation, location, and movement. There are 2 types. Our conscious proprioception is when we are cognitively and actively trying to position our body, such as in yoga, and unconscious proprioception, which is when we're moving about our daily tasks and we're less cognitively involved in the movement of our body. Our vestibular system, or our movement sense, tells us about the velocity or speed and direction of movement in which our body is moving. This allows us to maintain our balance in an upright position when working with vision, and to know our orientation in space when working with proprioception. There are 2 receptors for this sense, and they are located inside the inner ear. The first is the semicircular canals, which are pictured at the top. These provide us information about the direction of movement, regarding whether it is linear or rotary movement. And the otoliths, which are pictured at the bottom, provide us information about velocity or speed of movement. Interoception is a newly recognized sense that tells us about how our organs are working within our body. Examples include the stomach, the bowel and bladder, the lungs, and the heart. A difficulty with this sense may look like a child who is having trouble potty training due to a decreased awareness for when he needs to void his bowel or his bladder. Sensory and the brain. At any given moment, your brain is receiving information from multiple sensory systems. Do you feel your lungs expand and contract as you breathe? Do you feel the clothes against your body? What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? If your sensory system's working appropriately, you're able to tune out extraneous sensory information and focus on what you need to be focusing on. Your brain can habituate and accommodate. This means with increased exposure to a sensory input, you can tune out that sensory information. For example, I doubt that you felt the clothes against your body until I brought your attention to it. People with sensory processing difficulties cannot tune out the extra input, and they often appear distressed or distracted. The brain, or the central nervous system, works on a hierarchy. This means that the sensory systems and the input they provide are foundational to the development of other skills. We start with our sensory systems and the input, and from there we're able to develop sensory motor skills such as body awareness or body scheme, maturity of reflexes, the ability to screen out irrelevant stimuli, postural stability, bilateral integration or bilateral awareness, motor planning. From there, we develop our perceptual motor skills. This includes auditory language skills such as speech, visual spatial perception, attention, eye-hand coordination, ocular motor skills, and postural adjustments. Development of all of these skills are necessary to build up to the top tier, which includes academic performance, daily living activities, and behavior. If a block is missing from lower in the pyramid, it's much harder for a child to achieve their optimal academic performance. An important component of the brain for sensory processing is the reticular activating system. This is found deep in your midbrain, pictured here in red. The reticular activating system is the filter to the brain, and it decides which sensory information reaches the cerebrum or not. It's also known as the reptilian brain and is part of the oldest part of your brain. The reticular activating system controls our arousal and our sleep states and is part of our fight, flight, or freeze response. When this system is not acting properly, a person may have difficulty filtering out irrelevant stimuli. When a person has an overactive fight, flight, or freeze response, this can be a sign of dysfunction in the reticular activating system. Think of your body as a volcano. The walls to the volcano are the strategies and tools that you have for dealing with sensory inputs, and the lava that builds inside are the various sensory experiences you feel throughout the day. If you have a lot of tools, your walls are going to be tall, and it's going to take a lot more input or lava to build up in order to cause an explosion. If your walls are short, it's going to take a lot less for you to explode or have an emotional reaction to your environment. The volcano on the left is an example of a child with sensory processing difficulties. Notice that the triggers are things that their peers might be able to regulate. For these children, it may take a lot less to cause an emotional outburst or an explosion. So, how do you know if your child is having difficulties with sensory processing? Well, it really can look two very different ways. The first is the child who notices more than others or is more sensitive. They're considered hyper responsive. They may cry frequently or have meltdowns, cover their ears, they may not like wearing certain clothing, they appear nervous, they may not like being in a crowded place or being touched, they don't like loud noises or prefer the dark. They prefer bland foods or gag easily. They may become nauseous or throw up with certain smells or tastes, and they may avoid the stairs or be afraid of high places such as a jungle gym. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the hypo-responsive child, or the child that seems to not notice as much as their peers. These children bump into things and may not notice. They like to crash or fall. They frequently speak loud. They may take longer to be toilet trained or don't notice when they have soiled themselves. They may not answer when their name is called. They may not be bothered by flashing lights or seek out other visual stimuli. They may not be bothered being in a crowd. They wiggle in their seat or can't sit still for long. They can't attend a task for very long. Prefer foods with spices, which aren't bland. They prefer strong smells. They oftentimes will smell or put into their mouth seemingly random objects like paper or hair or fingers. They like jumping off of things or can be considered a daredevil. Or they like swinging high or spinning in circles. A child can be hyper-responsive in one sense and hypo-responsive in another sense, so it's important to be attentive to what it is that they are reacting to. For example, a child who's hyper-responsive to sound may cover their ears, but they might be hypo-responsive to movement and seek out movement by bumping into things or spinning in circles. So now you're thinking, how can we help? As a therapist, we target the sensory input and processing to optimize the motor output and overall everyday function. For the hyper responsive child, this may look like desensitization to sensory input, or for the hypo responsive child, it may look like bringing awareness to sensory input to increase their overall performance in everyday activities. Therapists who are using a sensory-based approach are typically pulling from Ayres' sensory integration theory. This was developed by Anna Jean Ayres in 1972 and is foundational for understanding sensory processing. Working within this model, there are certain assumptions that are held to be true. These are that the central nervous system is a hierarchy, as we saw before with our pyramid of skills. The central nervous system is plastic, which means that through intervention, we are able to change neural connections and the way that the nervous system responds to certain stimuli. In this theory, it's very important that the child is an active participant for integration of sensory information. This means that we're not imposing passive things upon the child, but they're actively engaging with it. The child must be presented with many different sensory opportunities, and it's critical for finding the just right challenge for that child. The just right challenge means presenting the child with something that is engaging enough that it challenges them, but it's not so overstimulating that they disengage with the task. In occupational therapy, we like to use the phrase heavy work always works, and this is referring to proprioception always being a calming and regulating input for people. This works off the idea that larger spinal tracts take messages quicker to the brain than smaller spinal tracts. So, proprioception, or heavy work, is transmitted via the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, which is pictured here on the top and is clearly a larger section than the lateral spinal thalamic tract and the ventral spinal thalamic tract. An example of this in real life would be if you stub your toe, you might have a tendency to rub your toe. What's happening is the pain from stubbing your toe is being transmitted via the lateral spinal thalamic tract. When you rub your toe, you're trying to override that sensory input by triggering your dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway with the proprioception of rubbing your toe. So every parent wants to know, is it sensory or is it a behavior? And the truth is, they can look the same. They look like hiding, yelling, crying, hitting, kicking, fleeing, or for verbal kids, they maybe change the subject to distract you. And it's important to tell the difference because it's important that we treat them differently. So for most parents, I'm going to say, what is the duration and the intensity of this outburst? Is it a true meltdown where they're going for hours and it's really intense? In which case, I'm going to say that's probably a sensory regulation issue. Whereas if it's more of a temper tantrum, it's kind of short in duration, low in intensity, then it's more of a behavior. And it really takes a keen eye to disseminate the difference between the two. Something that helps me to judge is it sensory or behavior is, can I redirect them when they're in the middle of this outburst? So if they're able to be redirected, it's most likely a behavior, whereas if they are unable to regulate and calm their body, then it's a sensory issue. So if I have Lucy and she's crying and kicking, and I say, hey Lucy, do you want your iPad? And she is able to say yeah and kind of comes over and starts using it, then I'm going to say that's probably a behavior. Whereas if I present Lucy with the iPad and she continues to hit and kick and cry, and she really is oblivious to me presenting this iPad, then I'm going to say that's probably a sensory issue because she's not able to regulate her body even with this preferred activity. And then the last thing you want to look at is it occurring consistently? So is it consistently when I present this type of input to them? For example, if we have Lucy again and I present her with a blueberry sitting on our plate and she starts screaming, is she screaming every time there's a blueberry on her plate, or does she maybe not notice until I say something about it? Can really tell me, is this a sensory issue or is this a behavior issue? Because issues with sensory tend to be more consistent over time, you can look for that consistency. Although behavior can be aversive, it's important to recognize that all behavior is communication of some form. For many children who do not have language or a way to express themselves, behavior can be a means of communication to get across how they are feeling, what they need, or when something is wrong. So let's think about a scenario. Jessica's a 2-year-old with no verbal communication, and her sensory cue to you is she covers her ears with an unexpected noise. The situation is she's been observed to hit her sister when they're having free playtime. Why is this happening? Well, we know that Jessica is avoidant because of covering her ears with loud noises, so maybe her sister's getting in her space and making loud and unexpected noises, and Jessica's having a hard time regulating that. Since she has no verbal communication, this is how she's telling her sister to stop what she's doing. For scenario 2, we're looking at Timothy, a 12-year-old boy who is slow to respond to his name, socially isolates, and only wants to be on electronics. Let's look at the sensory cues that he's giving us. He's slow to respond to his name. For me, this is saying that he's having troubles with auditory processing. When he receives auditory input, it takes him a minute to register. He socially isolates. This tells me he's at an age where he's aware that he's slower to respond to things than his peers, and he may miss a lot of information from his peers. He only wants to be on electronics. Electronics are a way for him to socially engage with others that gives him time to respond and process the things that he is reading or seeing or hearing. In the last scenario, we have Amanda, a 5-year-old who runs and hides when you try and brush her hair. This is telling me that Amanda is tactily defensive because she's trying to escape from the activity of brushing her hair. She may be someone that's a little more sensitive to different tactile input, and so her way of communicating this is to run and hide from you. Occupational therapists use their skills to break down scenarios such as these to figure out why things are happening for children and then work on a plan to intervene and provide more appropriate and adaptive responses to their environment. So many parents think my kid has anxiety or my child has anger problems. What does that have to do with sensory processing? And the answer is it really has a lot to do with it. Think about in the mornings, if you haven't gotten any sleep and you don't get your morning coffee, how things just tend to get on your nerves a lot more. Your sensory system isn't prepped and ready for the day. For these children, they're not getting accurate sensory feedback from their environment, and that's necessary for perceiving emotion, understanding emotions, regulating their own emotions, and knowing appropriate responses for other people's emotions. And sometimes this is difficult even for adults. We have a hard time verbalizing what exactly it is that's frustrating us or making us angry. And being in this state can send us into that fight, flight, or freeze response that we talked about earlier, and that makes a strong emotional connection from that sensory input to an emotional response. And when you're in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, your emotional reactions are so high that you're not able to be reasoned with. This is why cognitive strategies don't work with children who are in this major meltdown state. So this might be a lot of overwhelming information, but the bright side is occupational therapists go to school for years to learn about this information and to learn ways to help children regulate their arousal level. We help those children who are avoiding sensory input increase their exposure slowly so they can organize that input. We assist children who are unsafe because they might be those daredevil seekers to organize input and modulate that so that they can be safe and have better body awareness. We help children learn ways to vocalize their feelings and learn coping strategies and tools to increase their frustration tolerance and their tolerance overall for aversive stimuli. Lastly, it's important to know how occupational therapists work on sensory regulation. To the untrained eye, it might look like we're just playing in a gym, but an occupational therapist is thinking very hard about every single activity that they're having your child do, whether it be on the swing so that they can get more vestibular input, on a trampoline to get that deep proprioception. A lot of children go on a horse and work on postural stability, vestibular input, tactile sensory. I've also used an exercise ball to work on inversion over the ball, like this child is. That vestibular input can be very alerting, but it can also be very regulating. And the more sensory experiences your child has, the greater ability they're going to have to regulate and organize sensory information when they get it in the outside world, outside of the clinic, when they get it in the classroom. It'll help them to not be as overwhelmed or overstimulated or understimulated as many of our seekers are. And it'll overall help them to develop their nervous system to become more present and active and successful in their daily lives. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video and learn a little more about occupational therapy and sensory regulation. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment and I will get to addressing it as soon as I can.